Blood and betrayal built the Castiglione empire, but it was a cold bowl of minestrone soup that brought the ruthless boss to his knees. When a billionaire kingpin kicks down the door of a crumbling diner, he doesn't find his enemies, he finds the dead walking, and the penniless single mother keeping them alive. The neon sign outside Patsy's Grill on the grittier edge of Southside Chicago had been missing the P and the S for 3 years. To Chloe Hayes, the flickering 80s grill was a beacon of exhaustion. It meant 14-hour shifts, the permanent smell of stale fryer grease in her hair, and the desperate, scraping reality of survival. Chloe was 27, but her eyes held the heavy, hollowed-out look of a woman who had lived 3 lifetimes. She scrubbed the cracked linoleum counter with a rag that had seen better days, pausing only to stretch her aching back. Outside, a relentless November rain lashed against the greasy front windows, turning the streetlights into blurry halos of amber. In the corner booth, the only warm spot in the drafty diner, sat 5-year-old Leo. He was diligently coloring a picture of a superhero, his little legs swinging beneath the table. Every time Chloe looked at her son, a fierce, suffocating wave of love and panic washed over her. His asthma medication was due for a refill on Friday, and the $140 price tag felt like a mountain she couldn't climb. Her rent was already 2 weeks past due, and her landlord, a sleazy opportunist named Greg, had made it abundantly clear that he wouldn't accept partial payments anymore. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the ancient refrigerator. Chloe immediately reached beneath the counter, pulling out 2 heavy porcelain bowls. She didn't need to look up to know who had walked in. "Evening, Sam." "Evening, Rose," Chloe said, forcing a warm, genuine smile as the elderly couple shuffled out of the freezing rain. They were a tragic, fragile pair. Sam was a tall man severely hunched by time and a visible, lingering trauma. He wore a threadbare wool coat that was sizes too large for him, his silver hair unkempt. His wife, Rose, was smaller, frail as spun glass, clutching a faded tapestry handbag against her chest like a shield. Her eyes, a striking, piercing blue, were often clouded with the heavy fog of dementia. They had been coming to the diner for 6 months. Chloe had found them one freezing night in the alleyway behind the kitchen, huddling near the exhaust vents for warmth. They had no IDs, no money, and no clear memory of how they ended up in a dilapidated boarding house a few blocks away. Sam worked odd jobs sweeping floors, collecting cans, just to pay the $200 weekly rent for their slum room. Chloe, barely able to feed herself and her son, had done the only thing her conscience allowed. She fed them. Every night, precisely at 9 p.m. when the dinner rush ended and the boss went home, Chloe boxed up the leftover soup, the unsold meatloaf, and the day-old bread. "Chloe, my dear," Sam croaked, his voice thick with an accent. Chloe could never quite place something European, heavy, and old. He offered a trembling, deeply grateful smile. "We don't want to impose. Just a glass of hot water, if you please." "Nonsense," Chloe scolded gently, coming around the counter. She guided them to the booth right next to Leo's. "I made too much minestrone tonight. If you don't eat it, it's going in the trash. And you know how I feel about wasting food." It was a lie. Chloe had intentionally held back 2 portions of the soup, paying for them out of her own meager tip jar, so her manager wouldn't notice the inventory discrepancy. Rose settled into the vinyl booth, her cloudy eyes fixing on little Leo. A sudden, radiant smile broke through the confusion on her wrinkled face. "Oh," she whispered, reaching a trembling hand out. "Peter, you're drawing." Sam gently caught his wife's hand, pulling it back. "No, Rosie. That's Leo. Remember? Chloe's boy." He looked at Chloe, his eyes conveying a deep, apologetic sorrow. "She's having a hard day. The memories, they get tangled up." "It's okay, Sam," Chloe said softly, setting the steaming bowls of soup and a basket of warm bread in front of them. "Eat. Get warm." As the old couple ate with the quiet desperation of the truly hungry, Chloe went back to wiping the counters. She watched them from the corner of her eye. There was something undeniably elegant about them, even in their poverty. Sam held his soup spoon with a refined grace, And despite her ragged clothes, Rose sat with the posture of a queen. Chloe often wondered about their past. Sam rarely spoke of it, only vaguely mentioning a terrible accident that had taken everything from them years ago. The diner door chimed violently, snapping Chloe out of her thoughts. It was Greg, her landlord. He was a large, sweating man who smelled heavily of cheap cigars and stale beer. He didn't bother shaking off his wet umbrella, letting it drip all over Chloe's freshly mopped floor. "We're closed, Greg," Chloe said, her voice hardening. "Not for me, you ain't," Greg sneered, leaning heavily against the counter. He looked her up and down in a way that made Chloe's skin crawl. "It's the 14th, Chloe. I told you, I need the 450 today, or I'm changing the locks tomorrow morning." "I have 200, Chloe kept her voice low, terrified of scaring Leo or the old couple. "I get paid on Friday. I'll have the rest then. Please, Greg. You can't put a 5-year-old out on the street in November." "Not my problem," Greg said coldly, his voice rising. "This ain't a charity. 200 doesn't cut it. Maybe if you didn't waste your money feeding the neighborhood strays," he gestured aggressively towards Sam and Rose, "you'd be able to pay your damn rent." Sam stood up, his frail body trembling. "Do not speak to her that way," the old man demanded, his voice suddenly possessing a sharp, authoritative edge that startled Chloe. Greg laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "Sit down, Grandpa, before you break a hip." He turned back to Chloe. "Tomorrow morning, have the money, or have your bags packed." Greg shoved off the counter, knocking over a stack of plastic menus, and stormed out into the rain. Chloe stood frozen, staring at the scattered menus. A suffocating tightness gripped her chest. She was out of options. She had no family to call, no credit cards left to max out. She was drowning. "Chloe?" She looked up. Rose was standing beside the counter, holding out a beautifully embroidered, though heavily faded, silk handkerchief. "You're crying, my sweet girl," Rose murmured. Chloe hadn't even realized the tears were falling. She took the handkerchief, wiping her cheeks, forcing a wobbly smile. "I'm okay, Rose. Just tired. Finish your soup. I'll pack up some bread for you to take home." Little did Chloe know, the $450 she needed was the absolute least of her problems. Because 10 miles away, in the penthouse of a glittering Chicago skyscraper, a ghost from Sam and Rose's forgotten past had just been handed a photograph that would turn Chloe's fragile world upside down. Peter Castiglione did not believe in miracles. He believed in leverage, in fear, and in the cold, hard certainty of a loaded .45 caliber pistol. At 34, Peter was the undisputed head of the Castiglione crime family. He was a man carved from marble and ice, ruling his empire from the shadows with a ruthless efficiency that terrified even the hardened cartels down south. He was famously solitary, notoriously violent when crossed, and entirely devoid of mercy. The underworld whispered that Peter had lost his soul 10 years ago. It was a matter of public record. In the winter of 2016, a rival faction, the Moretti Syndicate, had planted a car bomb in the Lincoln Park estate of Salvatore and Rosa Castiglione, the former Don and his wife. The explosion had leveled the compound. The police had found charred remains. Dental records were inconclusive due to the intense heat, but the rings, the watches, the location, it was enough to close the case. Peter had buried 2 empty caskets. Then, over the next 4 years, he had systematically, methodically, and brutally eradicated every living member of the Moretti bloodline. He had painted the streets of Chicago red in the name of his parents. Now, sitting behind his sprawling mahogany desk, Peter stared at a glossy 8x10 photograph. His breathing had completely stopped. Standing across from him was Arthur Penhaligon, an elite private investigator whose services cost more than most people made in a decade. Arthur was sweating profusely, twisting his fedora in his hands. "Where?" Peter finally spoke. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that vibrated the heavy whiskey glasses on the credenza. A security camera outside a pawn shop in the South Side, Mr. Castiglione," Arthur stammered. "3 days ago, I was running facial recognition algorithms on cold cases, just routine maintenance on the servers, and it flagged a 94% match. I didn't believe it myself. I tracked their movements. They live in a flop house on 43rd. They go to a local diner every night. Peter picked up the photo. His hands, which had flawlessly executed men without a tremor, were shaking. It was grainy, captured in the rain. But Peter didn't need high definition. He knew the slope of those shoulders. He knew the way the man held the woman's arm to steady her. It was older, haggard, beaten down by time and poverty. But it was them, Salvatore and Rosa, alive. They survived the blast, Peter whispered to himself, the reality crashing into him like a freight train. They ran. He took her and ran to protect her. And the trauma. He thought I was dead too. Or he lost his mind. Peter stood up abruptly. The chair toppled backward, crashing onto the hardwood floor. "Silas!" Peter roared. The heavy oak doors swung open instantly. Silas, Peter's underboss and lifelong enforcer, stepped in. Silas was a mountain of a man, his face a map of scars. "Boss? Get the cars. Bring the doctor. We are going to the south side." Peter grabbed his wool overcoat, his eyes blazing with a frantic, terrifying light. Right now. 20 minutes later, a convoy of 3 black Escalades tore through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, ignoring red lights, scattering traffic. Peter sat in the back of the lead car, staring out the window, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in a decade. When the convoy screeched to a halt in the potholed parking lot of Patsy's Grill, the sheer intimidation of the vehicles caused a few pedestrians on the sidewalk to immediately turn and walk the other way. Peter kicked his door open before the SUV was fully in park. He ignored the freezing rain soaking his tailored Brioni suit. Flanked by Silas and 4 heavily armed soldiers, he marched toward the flickering neon sign. Inside the diner, Chloe was sweeping up the spilled menus from Greg's outburst. Leo was asleep in his booth, wrapped in his mother's jacket. Sam and Rose were just finishing their soup, preparing to brave the cold walk back to their room. The bell above the door didn't chime. It jingled violently as the heavy glass door was shoved open. Cold air and the smell of ozone flooded the diner. Chloe looked up, the broom freezing in her hands. The man who entered commanded the room instantly. He was tall, powerfully built, with jet-black hair slicked back from a sharp, aristocratic face. His dark eyes swept the diner with a predatory intensity. He radiated danger, wealth, and an absolute, terrifying authority. The men behind him were equally menacing, their hands resting casually near the bulges under their coats. Chloe's breath hitched. She had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know what a mob hit looked like. Her first, immediate instinct was Leo. She dropped the broom and moved instinctively to stand in front of her sleeping son's booth. Peter didn't even notice her. His eyes had locked onto the corner booth. Time stopped. Salvatore Castiglione looked up from his empty bowl. He squinted at the imposing figure standing in the doorway. The old man's face registered fear, but no recognition. He instinctively slid out of the booth, positioning his frail body in front of his wife. "Whatever you want," Sam said, his voice trembling but defiant. "We have nothing. We are just old people." Peter felt as if a knife had been driven through his sternum. His father, his invincible, terrifying father, cowering in a dirty diner, treating his own son like a hitman. "Papa?" Peter choked out. The word sounded foreign on his tongue. It was a plea, a shattered sound that made Silas, standing behind him, widen his eyes in shock. Sam gripped the edge of the table. I don't know you." Peter took a step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Papa, it's me. It's Dom." He took another step. Suddenly, a figure stepped directly into his path, blocking him from the old couple. It was Chloe. She was terrified. Her knees were visibly shaking beneath her stained apron, and her knuckles were white as she gripped a heavy ceramic coffee pot she had grabbed from a nearby table. But her eyes, a fierce, protective green, locked onto Peter's dark, intimidating stare. "Stop right there," Chloe ordered, her voice vibrating with a mother's desperate courage. "I don't know who you are, or what kind of sick shakedown this is, but you leave them alone. They don't have a dime. Back off." Peter stared at the woman. She was tiny compared to him. She smelled of vanilla, old fryer oil, and sheer panic. Yet, she stood between the head of the Chicago Mafia and his parents like a human shield. Silas stepped forward, growling, "Move aside, girl, before you get hurt." "No!" Chloe snapped, raising the coffee pot. "I'll scream. I'll call the cops. Just get out of my diner." Peter held up a hand, silencing Silas instantly. He looked from Chloe's fierce, exhausted face to his father, who was watching Chloe with immense worry, and his mother, who was looking at Peter with a hazy, confused curiosity. Peter's eyes drifted back to Chloe. He noted her frayed collar, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sheer audacity it took to stand up to him. "Put the pot down," Peter said, his voice dropping to a smooth, calm timbre that was somehow more dangerous than a shout. "I am not here to hurt them." "Then why do you look like you're here to bury someone?" Chloe shot back, refusing to yield an inch. Peter didn't smile, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a flicker of respect. "Because," Peter said softly, his gaze locking with Chloe's, "for the last 10 years, I thought someone had buried them." He took a slow breath, letting the rain drip from his jawline. "Do you have any idea who you've been feeding?" The silence in Patsy's grill was so absolute that the steady dripping of the leaky ceiling fan sounded like gunshots. Chloe Hayes slowly lowered the ceramic coffee pot. Though she didn't release her white-knuckled grip on the handle, her eyes darted from the immaculately tailored giant standing before her to the frail, trembling old man cowering in the booth. "Your parents?" Chloe echoed, the words feeling absurd on her tongue. "Sam and Rose are your parents? You're out of your mind. Sam sweeps floors at the packing plant. They live in a boarding house." Peter Castiglione ignored her, his dark eyes entirely consumed by the sight of his father. He took a slow, agonizingly deliberate step forward, dropping to one knee, right there on the greasy, cracked linoleum floor. It was a gesture of profound submission that made Silas, his battle-hardened underboss, visibly twitch. "Papa," Peter said, his voice cracking, shedding the icy veneer of the Chicago kingpin. "Look at my hands. Look at the scar on my left thumb." He held his hand up, palm out. "You gave me this when I was 12. We were out on Lake Michigan on the street. Jude. You were teaching me how to gut a yellowtail, and the boat pitched. You wrapped my hand in your own shirt so my mother wouldn't see the blood." Salvatore stared at the pale, jagged line crossing Peter's thumb. A violent shudder racked the old man's emaciated frame. His cloudy eyes widened, searching Peter's sharp features, mapping the jawline, the nose, the intense dark eyes. "Dom," Salvatore whispered. The sound was brittle, pulled from the deepest, buried recesses of a fractured mind. "They said the fire. They said you were in the house, Dom. The bombs." "I wasn't in the house, Papa," Peter choked out, reaching forward to gently grasp his father's trembling hands. "I was delayed at the docks. I thought I lost you. For 10 years, I thought I was burying ashes." Rose, who had been watching the exchange with a hazy, childlike wonder, suddenly reached out. Her fragile, blue-veined hand brushed against Peter's rain-soaked cheek. "Such a handsome boy," she murmured. "But you look so tired. Did you eat your minestrone?" A solitary tear escaped Peter's eye, a sight no man in the Chicago underworld had ever witnessed. He pressed a kiss to his mother's frail palm. "I'm here now, Mama. I'm taking you home." He stood up abruptly, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the commanding aura of a man who moved millions in illicit goods. He turned to the men behind him. "Dr. Sterling," Peter commanded. A silver-haired man carrying a sleek black medical bag stepped out from the rain. "Doctor?" Harrison Sterling was the former chief of surgery at Rush University Medical Center, before a gambling debt had forced him into the exclusive employ of the Castiglione syndicate. He moved quickly to the booth, pulling a stethoscope and a penlight from his bag. "Keep your hands off them!" Chloe shouted, her protective instincts flaring again as she stepped in front of the doctor. Peter looked at Chloe, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the sheer exhaustion in her posture, the cheap, frayed fabric of her uniform, and the fierce maternal fire in her green eyes. He also saw the sleeping boy in the adjacent booth. "Miss," Peter said, his tone leveling out into something almost gentle, yet entirely unyielding. "My name is Peter Castiglione. The people you know as Sam and Rose are Salvatore and Rosa. They are my blood. They are coming with me to receive the best medical care money can buy. And you are coming with them." Chloe laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "I'm not going anywhere with a man who travels with armed thugs. I have a job. I have a son. We are staying right here." "No, Chloe," Salvatore suddenly croaked, his grip tightening on his wife's arm. He looked terrified of leaving the only safe haven he had known. "Chloe stays. We stay. She feeds us. She protects Rosie." Peter's jaw clenched. He looked at Silas. "Did anyone trail us?" "Clean all the way from the loop, boss," Silas grunted, his eyes scanning the dark, rain-swept street outside. "But a convoy like this in the south side? We're a neon sign. The Calabrese crew still runs numbers 3 blocks from here. If their scouts see these plates, word gets back to Don Calabrese in 10 minutes. Peter swore softly under his breath in Italian. He turned back to Chloe. "Listen to me very carefully. You have kept the former head of the Chicago Mafia alive on leftover soup. If the people who tried to blow my parents to pieces 10 years ago find out they are still breathing, they will come to finish the job. And when they find out a pretty waitress in a broken-down diner was keeping them hidden, they will burn this place to the ground with you and your boy inside." Chloe's blood ran cold. The gravity of the situation slammed into her. She looked at the black SUVs idling outside, the grim-faced men guarding the doors, and the stark terror in Salvatore's eyes. "Pack your things," Peter ordered, gesturing toward the sleeping boy. "Wrap him in a blanket. Silas will carry him to the armor-plated car. We leave in 2 minutes." Chloe didn't have a choice. Her world had just fractured. She scooped up little Leo, wrapping him tightly in her threadbare coat. The boy stirred, murmuring sleepily, but didn't wake, as Silas, moving with surprising gentleness for a man of his size, took the child from her arms. As they walked out into the freezing rain, Chloe glanced back at the flickering neon sign of Patsy's Grill. She had a sinking feeling she would never see it again. The Castiglione estate was a fortress disguised as a masterpiece. Situated on 60 acres of private, heavily wooded land in Lake Forest, the sprawling limestone mansion overlooked the black, churning waters of Lake Michigan. High iron gates, perimeter cameras, and men, patrolling with suppressed rifles, made it clear that this was not just a home, it was a stronghold. Chloe sat on the edge of a king-size bed in a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, the carpets were thick, plush wool, and a fire crackled in the marble hearth. Leo was sprawled out in the center of the bed, sleeping soundly, completely oblivious to the fact that his life had just been hijacked by the Mafia. It had been 48 hours since the diner. In that time, Dr. Sterling had set up a state-of-the-art medical wing on the first floor for Salvatore and Rosa. They were suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic exposure, and complex PTSD. Rosa's dementia was advanced, but Dr. Sterling noted that her physical health, specifically her heart and kidney function, was surprisingly stable for someone living on the streets. "It was the soup," Dr. Sterling had told Peter in the hallway, a conversation Chloe had accidentally overheard. "That girl, Chloe, she's been making it with bone broth, fresh kale, and heavy legumes. It's a peasant dish, but it's dense in iron and amino acids. If she had been feeding them cheap fast food or empty carbs, your mother's heart would have given out months ago. That waitress literally kept them alive, Peter." Now, a soft knock on the heavy oak door jolted Chloe from her thoughts. Peter entered. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded tattoos. He looked less like a corporate CEO, and more like the dangerous kingpin he truly was. He held a manila folder in his hands. "How is the boy?" Peter asked, his voice low as he glanced at Leo. "He's fine. Confused but fine," Chloe said, crossing her arms defensively. "When can we go home, Mr. Castiglione? You have your parents. You don't need us anymore." Peter walked over to a velvet armchair near the fire and sat down, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He studied her for a long moment. "You don't have a home to go back to, Chloe." Chloe's heart dropped into her stomach. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Peter replied smoothly. He tossed the manila folder onto the low glass table between them. "But I did have my people look into your situation. I don't like blind spots. I needed to know exactly who had been interacting with my parents." Chloe glared at the folder. "My life is none of your business. It became my business the second you stood between a loaded gun and my father," Peter countered, his eyes flashing with an intense, unreadable emotion. "You're 27, widowed 3 years ago. A drunk driver hit your husband's truck. You've been working double shifts at Patsy's to pay off the medical debt he left behind. And yesterday morning, a man named Greg changed the locks on your apartment because you were $450 short on rent." Tears of humiliation stung Chloe's eyes. She hated that this powerful, untouchable man was looking at the pathetic, broken pieces of her life. "So what? It's my problem. I'll figure it out." "It is already figured out," Peter said flatly. "Greg has been dealt with. Your debts are cleared. The medical bills are zeroed out." Chloe recoiled, a surge of genuine panic rising in her chest. "You can't do that. I don't want your dirty money. I don't owe you anything." "You have it backward, Chloe," Peter said, standing up. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame forcing Chloe to look up at him. "I owe you. In my world, blood is the only currency that matters. You protected my blood. You fed them when they were starving. You treated them with dignity when the rest of the world walked over them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, solid gold money clip, thick with $100 bills, placing it on the bedside table next to her. "This is not charity. It is a debt paid. You and your son will stay here, under my protection, until I am certain the Calabrese family hasn't connected you to me. You will have whatever you need. Do you understand?" Chloe looked at the money, then up at Peter's hard, unyielding face. Behind the cold Mafia boss exterior, she saw the exhausted, desperate son who had wept on a diner floor. Before she could respond, the heavy oak door burst open. Silas stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his hand tightly gripping a suppressed Glock 19. The jovial demeanor he sometimes showed around Leo was completely gone, replaced by the lethal intent of an apex predator. "Boss," Silas growled, his eyes darting to Chloe before locking onto Peter. "We have a massive problem." Peter's posture instantly shifted into a combat-ready stance. "Report. One of our guys down at the 12th Precinct just sent an encrypted wire," Silas said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "The Calabrese crew didn't spot our cars at the diner. It was worse." Peter's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What happened?" "Your landlord, Chloe, Greg," Silas said, looking at her grimly. "When he left the diner that night, he went to a local dive bar to complain about his deadbeat tenant feeding the neighborhood ghosts. He started mouthing off to the bartender, describing the old man with the European accent and the burn scars on his neck. He tried to sell the information to a local fence, thinking he had spotted some runaway fugitives with a bounty." Chloe gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "The fence works for the Calabrese family," Silas finished, turning to Peter. "Don Calabrese knows Salvatore is alive. And boss, they know Chloe is the one who hit him. They just firebombed her apartment building 20 minutes ago. If she had been home, she and the kid would be ashes." Peter's face drained of all color, then instantly hardened into a mask of pure, terrifying rage. He looked at Chloe, who was shaking violently, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at her sleeping son. The ghost of the past hadn't just returned. It had brought a war with it, and Chloe Hayes was now standing right on the front lines. The air in the opulent guest suite simply vanished. Chloe's knees gave out, buckling under the sheer, suffocating weight of the realization. Her apartment, the faded photographs of her late husband, Leo's favorite stuffed bear, the meager savings tucked in a coffee can, all of it was gone, reduced to ash. She would have hit the floor, but Peter caught her. His massive arms wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to the present. For a man made of ice and violence, his grip was startlingly gentle. He pulled her against his solid chest, shielding her from the terror radiating from Silas's grim report. "Breathe, Chloe," Peter commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. "They didn't get you. They didn't get the boy. You are here. You are safe." "They burned it down," Chloe choked out, burying her face in his shoulder, her fingers twisting into the expensive fabric of his shirt. "Because of me. Because I brought your parents soup. Oh God, Leo. We have nothing left." "You have me," Peter said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a blood oath. He pulled back just enough to force her to look at him. His dark eyes were absolute, burning with a lethal, terrifying clarity. "Ennio Calabresi just signed his own death warrant. He thinks he's hunting ghosts and a helpless waitress. He forgot who runs this city." Peter turned to Silas, his demeanor shifting instantly from a protective anchor to a warlord commanding an army. "Lock down the estate. Triple the perimeter guard. No one gets in or out without my explicit verbal authorization. Put Dr. Sterling in the safe room with my parents." "And you, boss?" Silas asked, already racking the slide of his Glock. "I am going to cut the head off the snake," Peter said coldly. He looked back at Chloe, who was trembling by the bed. "Stay with Leo. Do not leave this room. When the sun comes up, this will be over." The rest of the night was an agonizing blur for Chloe. She held her sleeping son pacing the length of the luxurious bedroom, while the muffled sounds of tactical vehicles rolling out echoed from the courtyard below. She felt entirely displaced, a civilian thrust into a war zone, yet, paradoxically, she had never felt so fiercely protected. Across the city, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of 4 black SUVs rolling to a silent halt outside a deserted meatpacking plant in the Fulton Market District. Don Ennio Calabresi, a vicious, bloated man in his late 60s, was celebrating. He sat in a folding chair in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by a dozen heavily armed soldiers, smoking a Cuban cigar. He had just received word from a supposedly flipped Castiglione lieutenant that Peter was moving his vulnerable parents to a secondary safe house by the docks. Ennio was waiting to ambush the convoy. He didn't know the convoy was a ghost ship, and the flipped lieutenant was a dead man who had already confessed everything to Silas. The lights in the warehouse violently short-circuited, plunging the massive space into pitch blackness. Before Ennio's men could even shout in confusion, the heavy steel doors breached with a deafening explosion. Flashbangs deployed, blinding the Calabrese soldiers. Through the smoke and chaos, Peter Castiglione moved like a reaper. There was no grand speech, no cinematic monologue. It was a precise, calculated eradication. Within 90 seconds, the warehouse was dead quiet, save for the patter of rain on the tin roof and the heavy, ragged breathing of Ennio Calabresi. The emergency backup lights flickered on, casting long, bloody shadows. Ennio was on his knees, surrounded by his fallen empire. Peter stepped into the dim light, his tailored suit completely unsullied, holding a suppressed pistol at his side. "Peter," Ennio gasped, spitting blood onto the concrete. You broke the commission rules. A firebombing. It was just a message. We can negotiate." "You targeted a mother and a 5-year-old boy," Peter replied, his voice devoid of any human emotion. He stepped closer, staring down at the man who had ordered the hit on his parents 10 years ago, and the hit on Chloe tonight. "There are no negotiations, only consequences." Peter raised the weapon. The echo of the gunshot signaled the absolute end of the Calabrese bloodline. When Peter returned to the Lake Forest estate just after dawn, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He walked into the guest suite to find Chloe awake, sitting in the velvet armchair by the dying fire. She stood up immediately as he entered. He looked at her, expecting to see fear, expecting her to look at him like the monster he had just been. He had blood on his cuff, and the scent of gunpowder clung to his coat. Instead, Chloe walked over to him. She gently took his coat, slipping it off his heavy shoulders, and tossed it aside. She noticed a shallow bleeding graze on his jawline from flying shrapnel. Without a word, she led him to the edge of the bed and went to the ensuite bathroom, returning with a warm, damp towel. As she carefully wiped the blood from his jaw, Peter closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "Is it done?" she whispered, her hands steady. "It's done," Peter rasped, opening his eyes to look at her. "No one will ever hunt you or my family again." He reached up, his large, scarred hand, gently cupping her face. "You lost everything because of me, Chloe." "I lost a broken-down apartment and a landlord who hated me," Chloe corrected softly, leaning her cheek into his palm. "I gained a family." 6 months later, the gritty, flickering neon sign of Patsy's Grill on the south side was permanently gone. In its place stood a beautifully renovated, warm, and inviting brick-and-mortar restaurant named Rosie's Hearth. It wasn't a high-end, pretentious eatery. It was a community staple, serving the best, heartiest meals in the district. Chloe stood behind the pristine mahogany counter, wiping it down with a clean, white towel. She wasn't exhausted anymore. Her eyes sparkled with life and authority. In the back corner booth, the safest and warmest spot in the house, sat Salvatore and Rosa. They were dressed immaculately. Rosa's mind still wandered, but she smiled constantly, safely anchored by her husband's side. Little Leo was sitting with them, drawing a picture of a superhero. The bell above the door chimed a pleasant melodic sound. Peter walked in, shedding his wool overcoat. He looked dangerous, powerful, and utterly untouchable. But as his dark eyes locked onto Chloe, the ruthless kingpin of Chicago melted away, replaced by a man who had finally found his home. He walked behind the counter, wrapping his arms around Chloe's waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Did you save me any minestrone?" Peter murmured against her hair. Chloe turned in his arms, smiling up at the man who had burned down the underworld to keep her safe. "For you, always." Sometimes, salvation doesn't arrive on a white horse. It comes in a bulletproof SUV. Chloe Hayes saved an empire with a bowl of soup, and in return, a ruthless kingpin gave her the one thing she never had: absolute security. Their bond, forged in fire and loyalty, proved that even in a world ruled by blood and violence, the greatest power lies in one simple act of profound human kindness.